What is a Coinbase transaction? The Coinbase transaction is fundamentally different from every other transaction in the Bitcoin network. While regular transactions take existing Bitcoins from previous outputs and then send them to new addresses, the Coinbase transaction is the only type of transaction that creates brand new Bitcoins from nothing. It appears as the very first transaction in every block that gets mined on the Bitcoin blockchain. This transaction has no inputs in the traditional sense because it doesn't spend any previously existing coins. Instead, it generates new Bitcoins according to the protocol's predetermined rules. The most important thing to understand is that this is how the Bitcoin supply increases in a controlled, predictable manner. Every time a miner successfully solves the proof-of-work puzzle and creates a valid block, they earn the right to include a Coinbase transaction paying them the block reward. This reward consists of two components: newly minted Bitcoins called the block subsidy, and all the transaction fees collected from the transactions included in that block. The Coinbase transaction is literally the miner's paycheck for doing the computational work to secure the network. Without Coinbase transactions, there would be no way for new Bitcoins to enter circulation, and miners would have no incentive to expend energy securing the blockchain. Unique properties of the Coinbase transaction. What makes the Coinbase transaction truly unique compared to all other Bitcoin transactions is its structure and rules. First and most importantly, it has no inputs from previous transactions. In a regular Bitcoin transaction, you must reference unspent transaction outputs from previous transactions to prove you have coins to spend. The Coinbase transaction does not need to do this because it is creating new coins, not transferring existing ones. Second, the Coinbase transaction can only create exactly the amount of Bitcoin that the protocol allows at that point in time. This amount is determined by the current block subsidy plus whatever transaction fees the miner collected. The miner cannot arbitrarily decide to pay themselves more Bitcoin than the protocol allows. If they try to create a Coinbase transaction with too large a reward, the entire block will be rejected by the network as invalid. Third, there is a maturity period enforced by the protocol. The newly created coins in a Coinbase transaction cannot be spent until 100 additional blocks have been mined on top of the block containing that Coinbase transaction. This roughly equates to about 16 to 17 hours of waiting time. This maturity rule exists to prevent problems during blockchain reorganizations where competing blocks might temporarily replace each other. Finally, the Coinbase transaction is the mechanism through which Bitcoin's monetary policy is enforced. The halving events that occur every 210,000 blocks are implemented by reducing the block subsidy amount in the Coinbase transaction. How Coinbase transactions fit into blocks. Every Bitcoin block contains a list of transactions, and the Coinbase transaction always occupies the first position in this list. Think of it as the header transaction that establishes the economic foundation for that particular block. When a miner constructs a new block, they first create the Coinbase transaction to claim their reward, then they add all the pending user transactions they selected from the mempool. The order is important because the Coinbase transaction effectively sets up the reward structure before any other transaction processing happens. The block structure includes the block header, which contains metadata like the previous block's hash, timestamp, difficulty target, and nonce, followed by the transaction list. That transaction list always begins with the Coinbase transaction. After the Coinbase transaction come all the regular peer-to-peer transactions where users are sending Bitcoin to each other. These could be simple payments, multi-signature transactions, or more complex smart contract interactions. All of these transactions together are hashed into a Merkle tree structure, and the root of this Merkle tree is included in the block header. This creates a cryptographic commitment to all transactions in the block, including the Coinbase transaction. When the miner finds a valid proof-of-work solution, the entire block including the Coinbase transaction becomes part of the permanent blockchain record. This means the miner's claim to the block reward becomes permanently recorded and verifiable by anyone running a Bitcoin node. Visual block structure. To truly understand how the Coinbase transaction fits into Bitcoin's architecture, we need to visualize the flow from the network mempool through the miner's block construction process and finally into the blockchain. The process begins with users broadcasting transactions across the Bitcoin network. Each transaction includes a small fee that incentivizes miners to include it in their blocks. These transactions sit in a waiting area called the mempool. Miners monitor the mempool and select transactions to include in their next block, typically prioritizing transactions with higher fees because those fees become part of their reward. The miner then constructs a block by first creating a Coinbase transaction. This special transaction declares the total reward they're claiming, which must equal the current block subsidy plus the sum of all transaction fees from the transactions they're including. The block subsidy is the newly created Bitcoin amount defined by the protocol, which as of the 2024 halving is 3.125 BTC. Next, the miner adds all the selected user transactions into the block. These transactions along with the Coinbase transaction are organized into a Merkle tree structure. The Merkle root hash from this tree gets included in the block header along with other metadata. The miner then begins repeatedly hashing the block header with different nonce values trying to find a hash that meets the network's difficulty target. Once found, this constitutes valid proof of work. The miner broadcasts the completed block to the network where nodes verify all transactions including the Coinbase transaction are valid, confirm the proof of work is correct, and then add this block to their copy of the blockchain. Contents of a Coinbase transaction. Now let's examine exactly what data and fields are contained within a Coinbase transaction. The structure has three main sections: version information, the input section, and the output section. The version field indicates which Bitcoin transaction format is being used. The input section is where Coinbase transactions differ dramatically from regular transactions. In a normal transaction, the input references a previous transaction output by including the transaction ID and output index of the coins being spent. But a Coinbase transaction has no previous output to reference because it is creating new coins. Instead, it has a special field called the Coinbase field, sometimes also referred to as the Coinbase script SIG or Coinbase data. This field can contain up to 100 bytes of arbitrary data. Miners use this space in several ways. They often include identification information like their mining pool's name or a custom message. They also include an ExtraNonce value, which is essentially a secondary nonce that miners can increment when searching for valid proof of work. The ExtraNonce provides additional entropy beyond the nonce field in the block header, effectively expanding the search space for finding a valid block hash. Some miners have used this space for political statements or commemorative messages. The output section defines where the block reward goes. There must be at least one output that pays the miner's Bitcoin address. The amount in this output must equal the block subsidy plus collected fees. Large mining pools sometimes split the output into multiple addresses to distribute rewards among pool participants. The transaction also includes a lock time field, though this is typically set to 0 in Coinbase transactions. Coinbase transaction structure. Let's break down the technical structure with a concrete example. When we examine a Coinbase transaction, we see it organized into three primary components. The input section is unique because instead of referencing a previous unspent transaction output, it contains the special Coinbase field. This field typically includes the block height encoded at the beginning, which became mandatory after BIP 34 to ensure each Coinbase transaction is unique. Following the block height, miners can include their chosen data such as pool identification strings like the pool name or mining software identifier. Then comes the ExtraNonce, which is a value miners increment to create different Merkle roots without having to rebuild the entire transaction list. This ExtraNonce provides an additional dimension of variation when searching for valid proof of work. Some famous examples of Coinbase messages include Satoshi Nakamoto's Genesis block message about bank bailouts, and various political or cultural statements miners have embedded over the years. The output section is more straightforward and resembles regular transaction outputs. The primary output specifies the Bitcoin amount being claimed, which must exactly equal the block subsidy defined by the protocol at that block height plus the sum of all transaction fees from included transactions. As of the April 2024 halving event, the block subsidy is 3.125 BTC if transactions in the block carried fees totaling 0.15 BTC. The Coinbase transaction output would be 3.275 BTC. The output script then defines the conditions under which these coins can be spent, typically a standard pay-to-public key hash or pay-to-witness public key hash script pointing to the miner's address. Calculating the block reward. Understanding how the block reward is calculated is crucial to understanding Bitcoin's monetary policy. The total amount a miner can claim in their Coinbase transaction comes from two distinct sources. First is the block subsidy, which is the newly created Bitcoin minted according to the protocol's deflationary schedule. When Bitcoin launched in January 2009, the block subsidy was 50 BTC per block. This subsidy amount is programmed to halve every 210,000 blocks, which occurs approximately every 4 years given Bitcoin's 10-minute average block time. The first halving occurred in November 2012, reducing the subsidy to 25 BTC. The second halving in July 2016 reduced it to 12.5 BTC. The third halving in May 2020 reduced it to 6.25 BTC most recently. The fourth halving in April 2024 reduced the subsidy to 3.125 BTC. This halving will continue approximately every 4 years until the subsidy becomes so small that it rounds down to zero, which is projected to occur around the year 2140. At that point, approximately 21 million Bitcoins will have been created. The second component of the block reward is transaction fees. Every transaction that users broadcast includes a fee paid to incentivize miners to include it in a block. These fees are voluntary but practically necessary because miners prioritize transactions with higher fees. The fee is implicit in Bitcoin transactions. It equals the difference between the sum of the transaction inputs and the sum of its outputs. Any leftover amount becomes the fee. Miners collect all these fees from every transaction in their block and can claim the total as part of their Coinbase transaction reward. So the complete formula is total reward equals block subsidy plus sum of all transaction fees. Block reward calculation example. Let's walk through a concrete example of calculating a block reward in the current era following the 2024 halving. Imagine a miner is assembling a new block in late 2024. The current block subsidy is 3.125 BTC because we're in the period after the fourth halving. Now the miner looks at the mempool and selects transactions to include in their block. They might choose 2,000 transactions based on fee priority and block size constraints. Let's say these transactions have varying fees. Transaction 1 pays 0.0005 BTC. Transaction 2 pays 0.0008 BTC. Transaction 3 pays 0.0002 BTC, and so on. The miner sums up all these individual transaction fees. For this example, let's assume the total fees from all 2,000 transactions amount to 0.2 BTC. This is a realistic number for a full block with good fee pressure. Now the miner creates their Coinbase transaction. In the output section, they specify they're claiming 3.125 BTC as the block subsidy plus 0.2 BTC in fees, for a total of 3.325 BTC. This combined amount represents the complete incentive the miner receives for the computational work of finding a valid proof of work. The protocol enforces these numbers strictly. If the miner tried to claim more than 3.125 BTC as subsidy, or if they tried to claim more fees than actually existed in the included transactions, other nodes on the network would reject the block as invalid. This is how Bitcoin enforces its monetary policy through consensus rules that every node validates independently. It's worth noting that transaction fees have become increasingly important over time. As the block subsidy continues to halve and eventually approaches zero, fees will become the primary and eventually the only incentive for miners. The maturity period requirement. One critical rule governing Coinbase transactions is the maturity period. When a miner successfully mines a block and claims their Coinbase transaction reward, they cannot immediately spend those newly created coins. The Bitcoin protocol enforces a mandatory waiting period of 100 blocks. This means 100 additional blocks must be mined and added to the blockchain after the block containing the Coinbase transaction before those coins become spendable. Given Bitcoin's target of 1 block every 10 minutes, this translates to approximately 16 to 17 hours of waiting time, though actual time can vary due to random variation in block discovery times. This maturity requirement serves several important purposes. The primary reason is to protect the network from reorganization issues. Sometimes the Bitcoin blockchain experiences temporary forks where two miners find valid blocks at nearly the same time, creating competing chain tips. The network eventually resolves these forks by following the chain with the most cumulative proof of work, but the losing chain's blocks become orphaned. If a miner spent their Coinbase transaction reward immediately and then their block became orphaned, it would create complications because the Coinbase transaction would reference coins that no longer exist in the main chain. By enforcing a 100-block maturity period, the protocol ensures that by the time Coinbase outputs become spendable, there's overwhelming probability that the block containing them is deeply buried under subsequent blocks and will never be reorganized away. This provides stability and prevents double spending issues related to mining. From a practical standpoint, miners and mining pools are accustomed to this delay and plan accordingly. The waiting period is built into their operational models and payout schedules. Why it's called Coinbase. The terminology around Coinbase can be confusing, especially because there is a well-known cryptocurrency exchange called Coinbase that was founded in 2012. However, the term Coinbase in the context of Bitcoin's blockchain predates the company by several years. The word Coinbase was used from Bitcoin's very beginning in 2009 to describe this special transaction type. The etymology is quite logical when you break it down. The term combines the word coin, referring to the Bitcoin units being created, with the word base, indicating the foundational or origin transaction. In essence, the Coinbase transaction is the base transaction that creates the coin. It is the foundation of each block's transaction list and the origin point of new Bitcoins entering circulation. You can think of it as the base layer or foundational element of the block's economic structure. The term appears throughout Bitcoin's original source code and documentation from Satoshi Nakamoto. When Coinbase the company chose their name in 2012, they were making a reference to this Bitcoin concept, selecting a name that would resonate with cryptocurrency enthusiasts. This has led to ongoing confusion where people sometimes assume the transaction type is named after the company, when in fact it is the reverse. The company took its name from the pre-existing technical term. It is similar to how the Amazon company took its name from the Amazon River, not the other way around. In technical Bitcoin discussions, when people say Coinbase without additional context, they are almost always referring to the transaction type, not the exchange platform. The transaction is sometimes also called the generation transaction because it generates new coins, though Coinbase is the more commonly used term. Historic Coinbase messages. One of the most fascinating aspects of Coinbase transactions is the arbitrary data field that miners can use to embed messages into the blockchain. This has led to some memorable and historically significant messages being permanently recorded in Bitcoin's history. The most famous example is from the Genesis block, which is the very first block in the Bitcoin blockchain, mined by Satoshi Nakamoto on January 3, 2009. In the Coinbase transaction of this block, Satoshi included the message, "The Times 03/Jan/2009 Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks." This was the headline from that day's edition of the Times newspaper in London. Satoshi's inclusion of this headline served multiple purposes. First, it proved that the Genesis block could not have been created before January 3, 2009, because the newspaper headline did not exist before that date. This timestamp was important for establishing Bitcoin's launch date. Second, and perhaps more significantly, the message was a political statement about the traditional financial system. The headline referred to the British government's consideration of a second bailout for banks during the 2008 to 2009 financial crisis. By embedding this message, Satoshi was making a commentary on the failures of the existing monetary system and central bank policies, positioning Bitcoin as an alternative. Over the years, other miners have used the Coinbase data field for various purposes. Some have included marriage proposals, political statements, tribute messages to deceased individuals in the Bitcoin community, or simple declarations of support for various causes. Mining pools often include their name or identifier in every Coinbase transaction they create. Some miners have embedded a SCII art or hidden messages that can only be decoded through specific methods. These messages are permanent and immutable, forever preserved in the blockchain as part of Bitcoin's cultural and technical history. The role of ExtraNonce. Within the Coinbase transaction, the ExtraNonce field plays a crucial technical role in the mining process. To understand why this field exists and why it is important, we need to understand how Bitcoin mining works at a fundamental level. When mining, the goal is to find a hash of the block header that falls below the network's difficulty target. The block header is a fixed 80-byte structure containing the previous block hash, Merkle root, timestamp, difficulty bits, and a 32-bit nonce field. Miners repeatedly hash this header with different nonce values trying to find a valid hash. However, a 32-bit nonce only provides about 4.3 billion possible values. With modern mining hardware capable of computing billions or trillions of hashes per second, miners can exhaust the entire nonce space in seconds or fractions of a second. Once all nonce values have been tried without finding a valid block hash, miners need a way to create new variations of the block to try. This is where the ExtraNonce comes in. By changing the ExtraNonce value in the Coinbase transaction, the miner changes the Coinbase transaction itself. This changed transaction produces a different transaction hash, which in turn changes the Merkle tree of all transactions, and subsequently the Merkle root in the block header. With a new Merkle root, the miner now has a completely new block header to hash with all 4.3 billion nonce values again. This effectively extends the search space exponentially. The ExtraNonce can be thought of as a second nonce or an additional dimension of variation. Mining software typically increments the ExtraNonce after exhausting the primary nonce space. Some miners also manipulate the timestamp field or reorder transactions to create variation, but the ExtraNonce is the standard mechanism. This field is why Coinbase transactions often contain seemingly random numbers or incrementing sequences. Bitcoin's supply cap and approaching 21 million. Bitcoin is designed with a hard cap of 21 million coins, making it a deflationary currency with a fixed supply. This cap is not arbitrary but rather emerges from the mathematical series created by the halving schedule. The block subsidy started at 50 BTC and halves every 210,000 blocks. If we sum up this geometric series, we get approximately 21 million bitcoins. More precisely, the calculation goes as follows. 210,000 blocks times 50 BTC equals 10.5 million. Then 210,000 blocks times 25 BTC equals 5.25 million. Then 210,000 blocks times 12.5 BTC equals 2.625 million, and so on. When you sum this infinite series, you get approximately 20,999,999.9769 BTC due to some early mining irregularities and the fact that some Coinbase rewards were never claimed in the early days. The actual final supply will be slightly less than 21 million. We are currently well past the halfway point in terms of supply. As of late 2024, Over 19.5 million bitcoins have been mined, representing more than 93% of the total supply. However, the remaining roughly 1.5 million BTC will take over 100 years to mine due to the progressively decreasing block subsidy. The halving events will continue approximately every 4 years. The next halving is expected around 2028, reducing the subsidy to 1.5625 BTC per block. Then around 2032 it drops to 0.78125 BTC, and so on. Each halving makes newly issued bitcoins increasingly scarce. The final Satoshi, which is the smallest unit of Bitcoin at 100 millionth of a Bitcoin, is projected to be mined around the year 2140. At that point, the block subsidy will have decreased so much that it effectively rounds down to zero, and no new bitcoins will be created. This predetermined supply schedule is a core feature of Bitcoin's design, creating digital scarcity and distinguishing it from fiat currencies that can be inflated at will. What happens after the 21 million cap? One of the most frequently asked questions about Bitcoin is what happens when all coins have been mined and the block subsidy drops to zero. This will occur around the year 2140, over a century from now. The short answer is that Bitcoin does not stop or shut down at that point. The blockchain continues operating exactly as before, with miners continuing to mine blocks, validate transactions, and secure the network through proof of work. The fundamental difference is that Coinbase transactions will no longer include any block subsidy component. After 2140, a Coinbase transaction will look similar to today's version, but the reward section will contain only transaction fees with zero newly created coins. Miners will still gather transactions from the mempool, still construct blocks, still solve proof-of-work puzzles, and still broadcast valid blocks to the network. The only change is in the incentive structure. Where today miners earn a combination of block subsidy and fees, in the post-2140 era they will earn fees exclusively. This transition will not be sudden. The block subsidy is already declining with each halving, and transaction fees are gradually becoming a larger percentage of miner revenue. By 2140, fees will have naturally evolved to become the dominant incentive. The critical question is whether transaction fees alone will provide sufficient incentive for enough miners to maintain adequate network security. There are differing opinions on this. Optimists argue that if Bitcoin achieves its potential as a global settlement layer and store of value, the volume and value of transactions will be high enough that even small percentage fees will aggregate to substantial miner revenue. Additionally, Layer 2 solutions like the Lightning Network could process massive transaction volume while periodically settling to the Bitcoin base layer with significant fees. Fee-only mining economy. The transition to a fee-only mining economy represents one of Bitcoin's most significant long-term challenges and opportunities. Currently, the block subsidy provides the majority of miner revenue, with transaction fees typically contributing 5 to 20%, depending on network congestion. As halvings continue, this ratio will steadily shift. Already, we've seen blocks during high-demand periods where fees exceeded the subsidy amount. This provides a glimpse of the future fee-driven economy. For fees to sustain network security, several conditions need to be met. First, Bitcoin transaction volume must remain high or increase. More transactions mean more fees collected per block. Second, users must be willing to pay sufficient fees for block space. This requires Bitcoin to maintain or increase its value proposition, whether as a store of value, a settlement layer, or a medium of exchange. Third, mining technology must continue to become more energy efficient, reducing the cost of mining and making fee revenue more profitable. Fourth, the Bitcoin price must appreciate enough that even if individual fees remain modest in BTC terms, they translate to substantial value in purchasing power. Some analysts suggest that Bitcoin's fee market will naturally evolve to meet these needs. As block space remains scarce due to the 1 megabyte base block size and 4 megabyte weight limit with SegWit, competition for inclusion in blocks should drive fees upward, especially during high demand periods. Layer 2 technologies like Lightning Network could help by enabling millions of small transactions off-chain while periodically settling aggregated value to the main chain with large fees. Smart contract platforms built on top of Bitcoin could generate significant fee pressure. Another possibility is that mining will become more decentralized as the subsidy decreases, with many smaller participants replacing today's large mining operations. Mining incentives post-subsidy. Understanding mining incentives after the subsidy ends requires examining the economics of proof-of-work security. Bitcoin's security model relies on it being economically irrational to attack the network because the cost of acquiring enough hash power to conduct a 51% attack exceeds the potential benefit. Currently, this security is purchased primarily through monetary inflation via the block subsidy. In the future, it will need to be purchased through transaction fees paid by users. This is actually a more sustainable model in the long term because it directly connects network usage to network security. Users who benefit from Bitcoin's security properties will be the ones paying for that security through fees, rather than all holders paying through inflation. However, there are concerns about security budgets in a fee-only era. Some researchers have proposed modifications to Bitcoin's fee market or issuance schedule, though any such changes would require overwhelming consensus and are contentious. Others argue that no changes are needed and that market forces will naturally result in sufficient fee revenue. An important consideration is that by 2140, Bitcoin will be over 130 years old. The economic, technological, and social landscape will be dramatically different. Bitcoin's role in the global financial system will have been established or it will have been superseded by other systems. If Bitcoin has succeeded in becoming a foundational layer of value transfer, transaction fees from settlement of large value transfers, institutional operations, cross-border payments, and smart contract platforms could easily provide robust miner incentives. The key insight is that the transition is gradual, occurring over more than a century, allowing plenty of time for the ecosystem to adapt. Each halving provides a test of the fee market's ability to sustain mining, and so far the network has remained secure through each transition. Network continuity beyond 2140. A common misconception is that Bitcoin stops functioning or reaches an endpoint when the supply cap is reached. This is completely false. The Bitcoin network is designed to continue operating indefinitely, processing transactions and maintaining the blockchain forever. The protocol has no expiration date or built-in sunset mechanism. After the last Satoshi is mined around 2140, every component of Bitcoin continues working exactly as before. Full nodes will continue running, validating transactions and blocks according to the consensus rules. Miners will continue mining blocks, searching for valid proof-of-work solutions and adding new blocks to the chain every 10 minutes on average. Users will continue creating transactions, sending Bitcoin to each other for various purposes. Exchanges, wallets, and other services will continue operating. The only thing that changes is the composition of Coinbase transactions, which will claim fees but no subsidy. The blockchain itself continues growing indefinitely as new blocks are added. There is no maximum blockchain size or duration. As long as participants find value in using Bitcoin and miners find profit in securing it, the network persists. This is fundamentally different from systems that depend on central authorities or trusted parties. Bitcoin's decentralized nature means it continues existing as long as any group of participants want to maintain it. The code is open source and freely available. So even if every current Bitcoin user disappeared, new participants could download the software and restart the network from the existing blockchain. In practice, of course, we expect continuous operation rather than any restart scenario. The Bitcoin blockchain from 2009 forward will remain accessible, providing an immutable historical record of all transactions, including every Coinbase transaction ever created. Coinbase transactions in mining pools. Most Bitcoin mining today occurs through mining pools rather than individual solo miners. Understanding how Coinbase transactions work in the context of mining pools reveals interesting dynamics. A mining pool is a cooperative group where many miners combine their computational power to find blocks more frequently, then share the rewards proportionally. When a pool finds a block, the Coinbase transaction is created by the pool operator, not individual pool members. The Coinbase output typically sends the entire block reward to an address controlled by the pool. The pool then distributes appropriate shares to participants based on their contributed hash power. This distribution might happen through separate on-chain transactions or through off-chain accounting that periodically batches payments. Some pools use more sophisticated Coinbase structures with multiple outputs to pay participants directly in the Coinbase transaction itself, though this is less common due to increased transaction size and complexity. The Coinbase data field in pool mined blocks usually contains the pool's identifier, such as F2 Pool, Antpool, Foundry USA, or other well-known pools. This has led to interesting blockchain analysis where researchers can track which pools mined which blocks and study pool concentration over time. Mining pools have been a somewhat controversial development because they introduce some centralization to mining. The pool operator decides which transactions to include and has control over the Coinbase transaction. However, individual miners can switch pools freely if they disagree with a pool's policies, providing a market-based check on pool operator behavior. Some concerns exist about pool operators potentially censoring certain transactions or including invalid transactions, though such behavior would result in the entire block being rejected by the network, harming the pool's reputation and members' earnings. Summary and key takeaways. Let's summarize the critical points about Coinbase transactions. The Coinbase transaction is the special first transaction in every Bitcoin block that creates new Bitcoins and pays miners for their work securing the network. It differs from all other transactions by having no inputs from previous transactions, instead containing a special Coinbase field with arbitrary data and an ExtraNonce value for mining. The transaction's output pays the miner the block subsidy plus all collected transaction fees. The block subsidy started at 50 BTC in 2009 and halves every blocks, currently sitting at 3.125 BTC after the 2024 halving. This halving schedule continues until around 2140 when the subsidy reaches zero and approximately Bitcoins have been issued. Newly created coins from Coinbase transactions must mature for 100 blocks before becoming spendable, preventing reorganization issues. The Coinbase field has been used to embed memorable messages, most famously Satoshi's Genesis block headline about bank bailouts. After the subsidy ends, mining will transition to a fee-only model where Coinbase transactions contain only transaction fees as miner rewards. The network will continue operating indefinitely with this fee-based incentive structure. Bitcoin's monetary policy is enforced through the Coinbase transaction mechanism, with nodes rejecting any block attempting to claim more subsidy or fees than allowed. Mining pools create Coinbase transactions that aggregate rewards for their members. Understanding Coinbase transactions is essential to understanding Bitcoin's supply mechanics, miner incentives, and long-term economic model. These transactions represent the intersection of Bitcoin's technical architecture, economic design, and monetary policy, making them one of the most important concepts in the entire Bitcoin system. Thank you for your attendance. Please consider subscribing to the channel.